I woke up to the sound of metal tearing into the ground. At first I thought it was thunder, but when I stepped onto my back porch, the sky over my Arizona ranch was clear, and the noise was coming from my south pasture. A yellow excavator was inside my fence line. My fence had been cut open. Fresh dirt was piled across the grass. 3 workers in reflective vests were lowering a black pipeline into a trench that ran straight through land my family had owned for more than 50 years. I walked down there and asked the foreman, who gave him permission to dig on my property. He looked at me. HOA project, he said. Water infrastructure, we got approval. Approval from who? Less than an hour later, Marvin Cole, the president of the Silver Ridge HOA, pulled up in a spotless white SUV. His subdivision sat on the ridge above my ranch, behind gates, stone signs, and rules that had never applied to me. I told him to stop the work immediately. He smiled and said, "Mr. Walker, progress does not stop at an old fence." Then he pointed at the trench, like my pasture was nothing but empty dirt. He told me the pipeline crossed a community utility corridor. He said the HOA had a right to access water for the new development. And when I told him this was private ranch land, he leaned closer and said, "Water rights are complicated. I doubt you understand what we were legally allowed to use." That was his biggest mistake, because 3 months later, that same pipeline was ordered ripped out of the ground. The contractor was investigated. The HOA was fined. Marvin was voted out in front of the homeowners he had lied to. It all happened because my father had kept one old water deed locked in a metal box under his workbench. Marvin thought he was digging through forgotten ranch land. He was actually digging into proof that the water was mine. My name is Ethan Walker, and until Silver Ridge Estates showed up on the hill above my ranch, I thought silence was something a man could still own. My ranch sits outside a small desert town in Arizona, where the paved road ends, the fences get older, and the wind carries more dust than noise. It is not the kind of place that looks impressive on a real estate brochure. There is no stone gate, no clubhouse, no fountain at the entrance, and no committee telling people what color their mailbox should be. It is just 38 acres of dry grass, mesquite, cottonwoods, old cattle fencing, one weathered barn, and a narrow spring that has kept this land alive longer than I have been breathing. My father bought the ranch in 1967, back when the valley was mostly cattle land, and nobody cared what your fence looked like as long as it held. He was not a wealthy man. He drove the same truck for 22 years, fixed his own equipment, and kept every document he ever signed in a metal box under his workbench. When I was a boy, I used to think that box was full of boring papers, deeds, surveys, county receipts, water records, hand-drawn maps, old letters from attorneys. Things a kid does not understand because land feels permanent when you are young. You think dirt stays yours because everybody knows it is yours. My father knew better. He used to tell me, "Ethan, a fence shows people where the line is. Paper proves it when they pretend they can see the fence." I did not understand how right he was until years after he was gone. The most important part of the ranch was the south pasture. That was where the spring came close to the surface, where the grass stayed green a little longer during dry summers, and where my mother planted cottonwoods near the irrigation ditch later. When I married my wife Claire, she turned a small patch near those trees into a sunflower garden after she got sick. That garden became the place she liked to sit in the evenings. She said the rest of the world felt too loud, but the ranch still knew how to be quiet. When she passed, I kept the garden even after the flowers stopped coming back the same way. I kept the fence repaired. I kept the ditch clear. I kept the spring protected because it felt like protecting the last pieces of everyone I had loved. Then Silver Ridge Estates arrived. At first, it was just survey flags on the ridge. Then came graders, asphalt, streetlights, and luxury homes with desert-colored walls and enormous windows facing my pasture. Their advertisements called it peaceful rural living, which was funny because they spent the next 2 years complaining about the things that made it rural. They complained about my cattle. They complained about dust from my truck. They complained about my barn roof, my tractor, my hay bales, and once, believe it or not, the sound of coyotes at night. The HOA sent letters claiming my ranch created a negative visual impression for their community. One notice suggested, I move my equipment behind screening walls. Another asked me to repaint my barns approved by their architectural committee. I threw those letters in a drawer because I did not live in Silver Ridge. Never signed their covenants. Their rules stopped at their property line, whether they liked it or not. Still, I could feel them watching the ranch, like it was unfinished business. The developer wanted the valley to look clean, controlled, and profitable. The HOA wanted green lawns and decorative water features in a place where water had always been earned, protected and respected. And I was the old rancher at the bottom of the hill, sitting on land they could not quite control. So before we go further, tell me honestly in the comments. If an HOA you did not belong to started sending you rules for land your family owned for decades, would you ignore them, fight back immediately, or wait until they crossed the line? Because I waited. I told myself letters were just paper. I told myself rich neighbors with clipboards were annoying, not dangerous. I told myself nobody would be foolish enough to walk onto private ranch land and start digging without permission. And that was the mistake I made. I underestimated how far people will go when they convince themselves that your property is standing in the way of their progress. The day they dug up my ranch did not feel like a disagreement. It felt like an invasion wearing a hard hat. By the time I reached the south pasture, the excavator had already opened a trench nearly 3 feet deep. The cut ran past the cattle gate, through the low grass, and dangerously close to the old irrigation ditch that fed water toward the eastern pasture. That ditch was not pretty. It was shallow, uneven, and lined with stones my father had placed there by hand. But it worked in dry months. It was the difference between keeping grass alive and buying hay I could not afford. The workers acted like none of that mattered. One man held a rolled-up site plan. Another stood beside the pipe, checking measurements on a tablet. The foreman kept waving the excavator forward, even after I told him he was standing on private property. I asked to see the permit. He showed me a laminated work order from Mesa Utility Works with the words Silver Ridge Ho. Water access improvement printed across the top. There was a map attached to it, but the map looked wrong the second I saw it. The property lines were too clean. My pasture was shaded in pale gray and labeled utility corridor, as if calling it that made it true. I told him that corridor did not exist. The foreman sighed, like I was slowing down his morning. "Sir, I don't draw the maps," he said. "I just follow them." I told him to stop the machine until the county or the sheriff arrived. It was when Marvin Cole stepped between us. He had not come alone. Behind him were a woman from the HOA board named Patricia Wells, and a man in a blue dress shirt who introduced himself as a development consultant. None of them were wearing boots. None of them looked at the fence they had cut. They looked at me like I was the obstacle. Marvin said the board had spent months coordinating the project. He said the pipeline was needed to support the upper landscaping system for Silver Ridge. He said residents had paid for community improvements, and delays would cost everyone money. I told him again that he was on my land. He gave me that polished HOA smile, the kind a person uses when they want to sound polite while stepping on your throat. "Ethan, this is not about your feelings," he said. "This is about recorded access and responsible development." I asked him to show me the recorded easement. He did not. Instead, Patricia opened a folder and pulled out a copy of the same shaded map. She tapped the line crossing my pasture and said, "This area has been designated for utility access." Designated by who? She did not answer that either. The developer consultant finally spoke. He said the route had been reviewed by the HOA's planning committee. He said the pipeline would not interfere with my residents. He said they were willing to smooth the soil back out when they were finished. Smooth the soil back out. That was how he described ripping through a pasture my family had maintained for decades. While we were talking, the excavator bucket clipped the edge of the irrigation ditch. I heard the crack before I saw the damage. A section of the old clay pipe under the ditch broke open, and muddy water started bleeding into the trench. One of my cows spooked at the noise and pushed against the temporary gap in the fence. Another followed. Within seconds, 2 of them were out near the service road, confused and moving faster than cattle should ever move near traffic. I yelled for the crew to shut everything down. The foreman finally raised his hand, but Marvin looked irritated, not concerned. "That is minor damage," he said. "We can address it after completion, as if they had already decided my permission was optional. I spent the next 20 minutes trying to get my cattle back inside the pasture while strangers stood around my torn fence, discussing scheduled delays. One worker had the decency to help me move a panel into place. The rest watched, like it was not their problem. When I came back, dusty, sweating, and shaking with anger, Marvin was on his phone. I heard him say, "The ranch owner is being difficult." Not the property owner, not the man whose land we entered. The ranch owner. Like I was a character in their inconvenience. I told him I wanted every machine off my property immediately. Marvin lowered the phone and said, if I interfered with the crew again, he would contact law enforcement and report that I was creating an unsafe work environment. That was the moment I realized this was not a mistake. A mistake is when someone crosses the wrong line and apologizes. This was strategy. They had come early. They had cut the fence before I was awake. They had started digging before anyone from the county could be reached. And now they were trying to bury enough pipe fast enough that removing it would become more expensive than letting it stay. Marvin thought momentum was ownership. He thought if the trench was deep enough, it would give up. Then the HOA made it worse. That afternoon, every homeowner in Silver Ridge received an email from the board. I know because one of the residents forwarded it to me later, ashamed of what it said. The subject line was Delay to Community Water Improvement Project. In the email, the board claimed a neighboring ranch owner was obstructing approved infrastructure that would benefit the community. It said the HOA was working with contractors and legal advisors to resolve the issue quickly. They did not mention the cut fence. They did not mention the broken irrigation line. They did not mention the cattle. They did not mention that I had never signed an easement, never received notice, and never agreed to let them cross my land. By sunset, cars from the subdivision were slowing down along the road beside my ranch. Some people stared. One man rolled down his window and shouted that I was holding the whole neighborhood hostage. Another woman asked why I hated families having water. I remember standing by that torn fence as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Listening to strangers judge me from inside vehicles that had never once turned down my driveway. That was when the anger changed into something colder. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I walked back to the house, took photographs of everything, saved the HOA email, wrote down the license plates I could remember, and pulled my father's old metal document box out from under the workbench. The lock was stiff. The lid smelled like dust and machine oil. Ints were papers I had not touched in years. The deed, the survey, the old water records, the original county filings. And as I sat at the kitchen table with dirt still on my boots, I realized Marvin Cole had just made one very dangerous assumption. He thought I was only defending land. He had no idea he had started a fight over water. I did not call Marvin Cole again that night. I did not send him an angry email. I did not drive up to Silver Ridge and stand outside the HOA office demanding answers. I did not touch the pipeline, move their equipment, or block the road with my truck, even though every part of me wanted to make them feel what it was like to have someone step across a line they had no right to cross. Instead, I made coffee I never drank, sat at my kitchen table, and started treating my own ranch like a crime scene. That was the first smart thing I did. Anger would have given them something to use against me. Evidence would give me something to use against them. I started with photographs. I walked the entire trench from the cut fence near the county road to the point where the pipe curved toward the cottonwoods. I took wide shots, close shots, and photos with a tape measure laid across the damaged ground. I photographed the tire tracks, the broken wire, the bent fence posts, the clay irrigation line cracked open like a bone, and the muddy water pooling where the ditch had been torn apart. Then I photographed the workers' trucks' company logos, license plates, equipment numbers, the little permit sticker on the excavator, orange flags with survey markings, the wooden stakes with numbers written in black marker, every detail that seemed small enough for them to deny later. After that, I went to the barn and checked the cameras. I had installed them the year before, after coyotes got too close to the calves. They were not fancy, just motion cameras mounted under the barn roof, and one near the equipment shed facing the south gate. They had caught exactly what I needed. At 5:38 in the morning, 2 trucks from Mesa Utility Works rolled up to my fence with their headlights off until they reached the pasture entrance. At 5:46, one man got out with bolt cutters. At 5:49, the wire was cut and rolled back. At 6:03, the excavator crossed onto my land. No knock on my door, no phone call, no posted notice. No county inspector. No sheriff. Just men with machines entering private property while I was still asleep. I copied the footage to 2 drives and uploaded it to cloud storage because I had learned something from my father. If a record matters, never keep only one copy. Then I opened the drawer where I had thrown the HOA letters over the years. There they were, stacked in no particular order, each one more ridiculous than the last. A notice about my barn color, a complaint about hay bales visible from the ridge, a warning about non-conforming rural equipment, a request that I screen my cattle panels from community view. And now, the email accusing me of delaying an approved water project. I printed that one. Then I printed the reply I had sent, where I clearly stated that I had never granted an easement, or authorized access, and never received legal notice of construction on my parcel. By midnight, my kitchen table looked like an attorney had exploded across it. Photos, camera stills, HOA letters, printed emails, old maps, property tax records, repair invoices, notes about the cattle that had gotten loose, a list of every person who had been on my land that day. But the metal box under the workbench was the thing that mattered most. The box had belonged to my father. It was dented on one corner, dark green, with a latch that always stuck unless you lifted it just right. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and opened it for the first time in years. The smell hit me first. Dust, oil, old paper, and the faint memory of the workshop, where my father used to sharpen tools and curse at broken pumps. Inside were file folders tied with string. The deed from 1967, a survey from 1968, a second survey from the early 80s, handwritten notes from the county assessor, property tax receipts, the old plat map, and a faded envelope marked "water" in my father's blocky handwriting. My hands slowed down when I saw that word. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a recorded water deed, several county filings, and a document from the state water office describing the spring, the irrigation ditch, and the permitted use attached to my parcel. I had seen those papers before when I was younger, but back then, they meant nothing to me. They were just old legal words. That night, they felt like a loaded weapon. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office before it opened. It was the first person through the door. The clerk behind the counter was a woman named Denise who had known my parents. She looked at the copies I brought in, then at the parcel number. Then back at me, she asked, "Is this about the work up near Silver Ridge?" I said it was. She gave me the kind of look people give when they already know there is more trouble coming. For the next 2 hours, Denise helped me pull every recorded document tied to my ranch and the land around it. The original deed, the legal description, the survey map, the plat for Silver Ridge Estates, the utility easements that actually existed, the ones that did not, and most importantly, the water rights records attached to my south pasture. There was no recorded easement across the route Marvin's contractor had chosen. Not one. The only utility easements near my property ran along the county road and stopped before my fence line. Silver Ridge had access for power, sewer, and telecom inside its own subdivision boundaries. But nothing gave the HOA the right to cross my pasture. Then Denise pulled the water file. That was when everything changed. The spring near the cottonwoods was not just an old ranch feature. It was listed by location, flow description, and historical use. The irrigation ditch had been recorded as part of the Ranch's West water system decades before Silver Ridge existed. Right was old enough to matter, specific enough to enforce, and attached directly to my parcel. Denise read the filing twice, then said quietly, "You need a surveyor and an attorney." So I got both. The surveyor was Linda Rise, a woman with sun-browned skin, steel-gray hair, and the calmest voice I had ever heard from someone carrying equipment that could destroy a liar's entire story. She arrived at the ranch 2 days later with GPS gear, county maps, and a field assistant who set frickers while she studied the fence line. Linda did not care what Marvin had said. She did not care what the HOA map showed. She cared about recorded corners, iron pins, bearings, distances, and the legal description written into the deed. For 6 hours she walked my land, found 2 old survey markers, half buried, near the south fence. She measured from the county road. She checked the subdivision plat against my property line. Then she stood at the edge of the trench, looked at her tablet, and shook her head. "This is not even close," she said. "The pipeline was not on a utility corridor. It was not on HOA land. It was not on a public easement. It was inside my ranch, crossing my south pasture, cutting through the recorded water system my family had used for generations." Linda prepared a preliminary map for me that afternoon. Where she marked the pipeline route in red. She marked my property boundary in black. Then she marked the recorded water features in blue. The red line crossed the blue. That single image explained the whole case better than any argument ever could. Next, I called the County Planning and Development Office. I asked for permits related to the Silver Ridge Water Project. The employee on the phone found a permit for work inside the subdivision and another for a connection near the public road.
Yes.
But when I gave him my parcel number and asked for any permit allowing excavation through my land, he went quiet. I heard keyboard clicking, then more clicking. Finally, he said, "I'm not seeing authorization for work on that parcel." I asked him to send that in writing. He did. By the end of the week. I had a folder that showed 3 simple things. They had no easement, had no permit for my parcel, and they were digging through land tied to recorded water rights they did not own. That was when I called Rebecca Shaw. Rebecca was a property attorney in the county seat, the kind of lawyer who did not waste words trying to sound impressive. She let me talk for 15 minutes, then asked for the documents. I sent her the deed, the water records, the surveyor's preliminary map, the camera footage, the HOA email, the work order, and every photograph I had taken. She called me back the next morning. Her first words were, "Do not speak to the HOA directly anymore." Then she told me why. The pipeline was no longer just a disagreement about land access. It involved trespass, property damage, possible misrepresentation to contractors, unpermitted excavation, interference with an irrigation feature, and potential unlawful use or diversion connected to recorded water rights. Rebecca drafted a demand letter that same day. Ordered the HOA, Mesa Utility Works, and any agents working under them to stop all activity on my property, preserve all records, leave the pipeline inactive, and provide copies of every map, permit, contract, board approval, engineering plan, and legal opinion they claimed justified the route. She also sent notice to the contractor, as insurance company, and the county inspection office. Griffin responded 2 days later, not with an apology, not with a permit, not with an easement, with a letter accusing me of exaggerating the issue and misunderstanding community infrastructure needs. He wrote that the HOA believed the route had been properly designated, and that my refusal to cooperate could expose me to liability for project delays. When Rebecca read that line to me over the phone, she laughed once, not because it was funny, because he had just put the HOA's arrogance in writing. She told me he still thinks this is about permission. He doesn't understand that the documents already answer that question. At night, I sat on the porch and looked toward the dark line of the trench cutting through the pasture. The machines were quiet. The cattle had settled. The cottonwoods moved in the wind like nothing had changed. Everything had changed. 2 days earlier, Marvin had been standing on my land, telling me I did not understand water rights. Now, my attorney had his letter, my surveyor had his route, the county had his missing permit, and I had the water deed my father had saved, for exactly the kind of person who thought an old fence meant nobody was watching. The HOA had brought machines. I had brought records and records. I was about to learn make a very different kind of noise. The thing about a legal fight is that most people imagine it starts in a courtroom. Mine started with a blue line on a survey map. Linda Rise sent the final survey on a Thursday morning. I remember that because I was standing in the barn trying to repair a hinge on the feed room door. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, the email subject line was simple: Walker Ranch Boundary and Water Feature Overlay. I opened it right there, with grease on my fingers and dust on my boots. At first, it looked like any other survey. Black boundary lines, parcel numbers, measurements, bearings, corner markers, county road references. Then I saw the pipeline route marked in red. I entered through the cut section of my south fence, crossed the pasture, bent toward the cottonwoods, and ran directly across the recorded irrigation feature attached to my water deed. There was the blue line. That blue line represented the spring-fed ditch and water corridor my family had used for decades. It was not decorative. It was not approximate. It was recorded, described, and tied to my parcel through old county and state water filings. The red line crossed the blue line almost perfectly. I stood there staring at the screen. And for the first time since the excavator tore into my pasture, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt the ground shift underneath the HOA. Marvin Cole had built his entire argument on one idea. The pipeline was crossing some vague community utility corridor. But Linda's map made that impossible to believe. There was no corridor. There was no recorded access. There was no legal path across my ranch. There was only my land, my water system, and their pipe cutting through both. I forwarded the survey to Rebecca Shaw, my attorney. She called me less than 10 minutes later. Her voice was calm. Different. Sharper. She said, "Ethan, this is worse for them than I thought." Then she walked me through it, piece by piece. The first problem was trespass. That part was obvious. The contractor had crossed onto private property without a recorded easement, without written permission, and without any permit tied to my parcel. The HOA could not fix that by saying a committee had approved it. A committee does not create property rights. The second problem was damage. They had cut my fence, disturbed my pasture, damaged the irrigation ditch, and caused cattle to get loose. Every photo, every invoice, every video clip mattered. The third problem was misrepresentation. Mesa Utility Works had relied on a map supplied by the HOA or its development consultant. If that map labeled my land as a utility corridor without any recorded document supporting it, then somebody had given the contractor false authority to enter. But the fourth problem was the one that made Rebecca pause. Water. She explained that land disputes could be expensive. Fence damage could be negotiated. Even trespass could sometimes be settled quietly if everyone wanted to avoid court. Recorded water rights were different, especially in a dry county where every gallon had value and every old claim had history. My father's water deed was not just a sentimental paper from the past. It described a spring source, an irrigation route, and a right of use attached to the ranch long before Silver Ridge Estates was ever drawn on a plat map. The HOA's pipeline did not merely cross dirt. It crossed infrastructure connected to that recorded right. And the engineering plan Rebecca had demanded from the contractor made it worse. When Mesa Utility Works finally turned over their preliminary drawings, there was a small notation near the place where the pipeline passed my ditch. It was easy to miss. A little arrow, a short label. Possible future tie-in point. Possible future tie-in point. I read those words 3 times. The HOA had told me they were only moving water through the area. They had told homeowners this was an improvement project for community landscaping. Marvin had stood in my pasture and acted like the pipeline was just crossing unused ranch land. But the plan showed something else. They had positioned the line near my spring-fed irrigation system in a way that could allow a future connection. Maybe they had not tapped it yet. Maybe they planned to deny it forever. But the design showed they were not just passing through. They were aiming at my water. Rebecca said it carefully because good attorneys do not overpromise. She said this suggests intent, or at minimum, reckless disregard. That was legal language. I understood it a different way. They knew exactly why they wanted that route. The upper subdivision had been advertised with desert landscaping, green spaces, and future water features. The developer had promised buyers the community would feel like an oasis. But the ridge was dry. Their wells and municipal allocation were limited. Every improvement cost money. Every gallon had to come from somewhere. And below them sat my ranch, with an old spring, a recorded water right, and one widower they assumed would not know the difference between a utility line and a water grab. What was the legal turn? Not the deed by itself, not the survey by itself, not the missing permit by itself. It was the way, all the documents locked together. The deed proved the ranch owned the water right. The survey proved. The pipeline crossed the protected water feature. The county records proved. There was no easement. The permit file proved no one had permission to excavate my parcel. Camera footage proved they entered before sunrise and cut the fence. The HOA email proved they lied to residents by calling the project approved. And Marvin's letter proved they kept pushing even after being told they had no right to be there. Rebecca drafted a second letter, and this one did not sound like a request. It was a notice of legal claims. She sent it to the HOA board, Mesa Utility Works, the development consultant, insurance carriers, the county planning office, code enforcement, and the state water resources division. She included the survey overlay, the recorded water deed, the camera stills, and the permit confirmation showing no authorization for excavation on my parcel. The letter demanded immediate preservation of all communications related to the route selection. Water access, easements, board approvals, developer promises, engineering drawings, and any discussion of using or connecting to water sources on or near my property. It also warned them not to bury, activate, test, flush, connect, conceal, or alter the pipeline until county and water officials had inspected the site. That last part mattered, because the next morning, 2 workers from Mesa Utility Works showed up with a small crew and started unloading equipment near the trench. I walked down with my phone recording. The foreman looked exhausted, not angry anymore. Just tired in the way people look when they realize the job they were handed might cost them their license. He said they were only there to secure the site. I asked if securing the site included covering the pipeline before inspection. He did not answer. I called Rebecca from the pasture. She called the county. Within 40 minutes. Our county inspector told the crew to leave everything exposed until an official review. That was the first time I saw fear on the contractor's face. Not from me, from paperwork. Marvin called later that afternoon. I did not answer. Then he texted. He wrote that the board wanted to resolve the matter. Neighbor to neighbor, he said. The HOA had never intended to cause distress. He said he was sure we could reach a practical agreement that would allow the project to continue while compensating me for minor disruption. Minor disruption. The man had cut open my fence, dug through my pasture, damaged my irrigation ditch, lied to his residents, and built a pipeline across land tied to recorded water rights. Now that the documents were no longer on his side, he wanted to call it minor. I forwarded the text to Rebecca. She replied with one sentence, "Do not respond," so I did not. A few hours later, the HOA's attorney sent Rebecca a proposal. He wanted to pay me a one-time easement fee. In exchange, I would sign a retroactive access agreement, release all claims, allow the pipeline to remain, and agree not to interfere with future maintenance. Retroactive. That word told me everything. They were not trying to prove they had permission. They were trying to buy permission after they had already taken it. Rebecca explained the danger. If I signed, they could use that easement forever. They could come back for repairs, upgrades, expansions, inspections, and maybe even future connection rights, depending on how the language was written. The pipeline would become a permanent scar across the ranch, and the water issue would get buried under settlement paperwork. I told her no, not for pride, not because I wanted revenge. Some things cannot be fixed with a check written by people who still believe they did nothing wrong. The next step came from the county after receiving Rebecca S. packet. The planning office compared the HOA S submitted project map to the recorded plats. That was when they discovered the HOA had included a route exhibit that showed my south pasture, as if it were part of a shared infrastructure zone. No recorded document supported that label. No deed, no easement, no dedication, no right-of-way, nothing. Someone had shaded my land on a map and treated that shading like law. The county also found that the work near the road had been permitted only up to a certain point. The permit did not authorize private excavation across my parcel. It did not authorize interference with irrigation features. It did not authorize construction within the area marked in my water filing. The inspector's email was short, but it changed everything. He wrote that the project appeared to exceed the scope of approved work and required immediate field review. Rebecca sent me a copy. I printed it and placed it beside my father's water deed. For 2 days, Silver Ridge went quiet. No trucks, no workers, no HOA letters, no residents yelling from car windows. Then one of the homeowners, a retired school principal named Marlene, called me. She said she had received a forwarded copy of Rebecca S. notice from someone inside the community, and she wanted to know if it was true that the HOA did not actually have an easement. I told her to ask her board for the recorded document. She went silent for a moment. Then she said, "You told us you were blocking a legal project," I said. "Then they should be able to show you the legal paper." That sentence spread through Silver Ridge faster than any rumor I could have started myself. At the end of the week, homeowners were asking questions at the HOA office. Where was the easement? Who approved the route? Why was private ranch land labeled as a utility corridor? Were HOA funds being used on a project that might have to be removed? And why had the board told residents I was the problem before verifying the records? Marvin tried to regain control. He sent a community update saying the matter involved complex historical property documentation and that the board was working with professionals to clarify access rights. That was the first time he stopped saying the project was approved. Rebecca noticed it immediately. She said, "That means they know." But the final turn came from the Water Resources Division. A state water official reviewed the deed, the old filings, Linda S. survey overlay, and the pipeline drawings. He did not issue a final ruling that day, but he sent a notice that any construction affecting the recorded spring system, irrigation ditch, or water delivery route may require review and could not proceed until the agency determined whether the work interfered with existing rights. That notice was copied to the county, the contractor, and the HOA, and the developer. That was when panic truly hit them, because now this was no longer Ethan Walker complaining about a trench. This was a documented property rights dispute involving a recorded senior water right. Unpermitted excavation, possible interference with an irrigation feature, and a pipeline built by an HOA that could not produce an easement. The Developer S consultant stopped answering Marvin S calls. Utility Works notified the HOA that all work was suspended pending legal clarification. The HOA S insurance carrier requested all board communications related to the project. Marvin, the same man who had stood in my pasture and told me I did not understand water rights, asked through his attorney whether I would consider mediation. I asked Rebecca what mediation meant. She said, "It means they finally found the deed." I drove out to the south pasture that evening, just before sunset. The trench was still there, ugly and open, with the black pipeline lying inside it, like evidence waiting for a courtroom. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. The broken ditch had been temporarily blocked, but I could still hear water moving underground, faint and steady for the first time in weeks. I thought about my father. I thought about him sitting at that workbench, filing away documents most people would have thrown in a drawer and forgotten. I thought about him telling me that paper proves the line when people pretend they cannot see the fence. He had been right about the fence, but he had also been right about something else. People who want your land rarely start by saying they want to take it. They call it access. They call it progress. They call it infrastructure. They call it community benefit. When the survey lines are drawn, when the deeds are opened, when the permits are checked, and when the old water records come out of the box, all those pretty words either stand on legal ground or collapse into dirt. Marvin's words collapsed, and the next time he saw me, it would not be in my pasture. It would be in a county hearing room, where every map, every email, every permit, every lie, every inch of that pipeline would be placed on the record. The county inspection happened on a Monday morning, and for the first time since the pipeline crew entered my land. Nobody on that pasture was pretending Marvin All Cole was in charge. A white county truck pulled through my gate at 8:12. Behind it came a second vehicle from code enforcement, then Linda Riaz in her survey truck, and finally a sheriff's deputy who parked near the cut section of fence and stepped out with a small notebook in his hand. Marvin arrived 10 minutes late. He came fast, tires kicking dust behind his white sub. But the confidence he had carried the first day was gone. He still wore the same pressed clothes and expensive sunglasses, but now he had an attorney beside him, and that attorney was carrying a folder thick enough to make Marvin look nervous. Rebecca stood next to me near the trench. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The county inspector walked the route slowly, checking the exposed pipe, the trench walls, the broken irrigation line, and the distance between the excavation and the recorded water feature on Linda S. map. Every few steps, he stopped, took photographs, and made notes. He asked the question that changed the tone of the morning. Who authorized entry onto this parcel? The foreman from Mesa Utility Works pointed toward Marvin. Marvin S. attorney immediately stepped forward and said the HOA believed the route followed designated utility access. The inspector looked at him and said, "Belief is not a recorded easement." But he answered. Linda laid out her survey map on the hood of her truck. The black line showed my property boundary. The red line showed the pipeline. The blue line showed the spring-fed irrigation feature tied to my water deed. The inspector studied it for a long time. Then he compared it to the HOA project map. That was when the lie became visible to everyone standing there. On the HOA map, my pasture had been shaded and labeled like a utility corridor. Recorded county plat, it was private ranch land. No dedication, no easement, no right-of-way, no legal access for HOA construction. The sheriff's deputy asked the foreman whether he had written permission from me. The foreman said no. He asked whether anyone had knocked on my door before cutting the fence. The foreman looked down and said, "We were told access was cleared." Rebecca wrote that sentence down. Code enforcement ordered the trench to remain open and the pipeline inactive until the county completed its review. The inspector issued a stop work notice on site. Mesa Utility Works was told not to cover, test, connect, flush, or activate the line. The contractor S insurance carrier was notified before lunch. Marvin tried one last time to control the room. He said the HOA was acting for the good of the community. Our inspector turned toward him and said, "Community benefit does not override private property records." That sentence hit harder than any shouting could have. A week later, we were in a county hearing room. It was not a courtroom, but it felt close enough. There were microphones, folders, county officials, legal counsel, and homeowners from Silver Ridge packed into the back rows. Some of them had come expecting to see the stubborn rancher who delayed their water project. Instead, they saw maps, permits, camera stills, deed records, and emails. Rebecca presented everything in order. Early morning entry, the cut fence, the missing easement, the limited permit, the damaged irrigation ditch, the recorded water deed, the contractor S drawing showing a possible future tie-in near my water system. And she read Marvin S' own words back into the record. "Water rights are complicated. I doubt you understand what we legally allowed to use." The room went completely quiet. Marvin S' attorney tried to call it a misunderstanding. He said the HOA had relied on planning documents and had no intention of violating anyone's rights. That was when the county attorney asked for the recorded easement. Marvin S' attorney did not have one. He asked for written permission from the landowner. They did not have that either. He asked why construction began before the access issue was verified. Nobody from the HOA answered. At the end of the hearing, the county issued its decision. The pipeline segment on my ranch was outside the approved scope of work. The excavation had occurred without proper authorization. The line could not be activated. The HOA and contractor had to submit a removal and restoration plan, and the Water Resources Division would conduct a separate review of any interference with my recorded water rights. For the first time, the homeowners in the back were not looking at me like I was the problem. They were looking at Marvin. The pipeline came out of the ground on a cold morning, 3 weeks after the county hearing. I stood by the south fence with Rebecca beside me, watching the same company that had buried it dig it back up under county supervision. This time, there were no sunglasses, no speeches about progress, no HOA board members, acting like my land was just a blank space on their development map. There were inspectors, there were photographs, there were measurements, and there was a written order taped inside the county truck, stating that the pipeline segment crossing Walker Ranch had been installed outside the approved scope of work and had to be removed. Utility Works brought in a smaller excavator, hand tools near the irrigation ditch, and a restoration crew. They lifted the black pipe from the trench section by section, repaired the broken ditch, replaced the damaged clay line, reset the fence posts, and brought in fresh soil where the pasture had been torn open. Linda Rise returned to verify the boundaries before anything was covered. The county did not let them simply smooth the dirt and leave. They had to restore the grade. They had to reseed the pasture. They had to stabilize the ditch. They had to document every foot of work. The contractor S insurance paid for most of the property damage. The HOA paid for the rest after Rebecca made it clear that a lawsuit would cost them more than settlement. They reimbursed my survey fees. Attorney fees, fence repairs, irrigation repairs, livestock expenses, and restoration costs. Then came the part Marvin hated most. The HOA had to send a written correction to every homeowner in Silver Ridge. Not a vague update, not a polished excuse, a correction. It stated that the board had previously described the water project as approved, but the pipeline route across my ranch had no recorded easement, no landowner permission, and no county authorization for that parcel. It also admitted that construction had damaged private property, and that the project had been suspended after review of recorded water rights. I heard the meeting was brutal. Marlene, the retired school principal, stood up and asked why the board had called me difficult when I was the only person in the entire situation holding the correct documents. Another homeowner asked how much HOA money had been spent defending a project the board could not legally justify. Someone else demanded to know whether the developer had pressured Marvin to rush the pipeline before the next sales phase opened. Marvin tried to explain. Nobody wanted to hear it. 2 weeks later, he resigned before a recall vote could remove him. Patricia left the board at the next meeting. The developer lost its landscaping timeline. Its planned water feature was canceled, and Silver Ridge had to redesign the entire system using a legal route that stayed inside its own property. HOA Utility Works received a formal warning from the county and had to update its verification process before starting any job involving private easements. Their foreman later stopped by my ranch, not with lawyers, not with excuses, but with his hat in his hands. He said he should have checked the documents himself before crossing my fence. I accepted the apology, not because it fixed everything, because at least he finally understood what Marvin never had. My ranch was not empty land. It was not leftover dirt waiting for a subdivision to find us a use for it. It was home. The south pasture took months to heal. The new grass came in uneven at first. The repaired ditch looked too clean, too straight, like a scar after stitches. But by the next spring, the water moved through it again. The cottonwoods leafed out. The cattle returned to grazing along the fence, and for the first time in a long while, the ranch sounded quiet again. I kept my father's water deed in a new fireproof safe after that, but I also framed a copy and hung it in the workshop, right above the old metal box where he had kept it for decades. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if he had thrown those papers away, if I had yelled instead of documenting, if I had signed Marvin S. retroactive easement, just to make the conflict disappear. The pipeline might still be under my pasture. The HOA might still be using my land. And someday, when the water became even more valuable, they might have claimed the whole thing had always been theirs. This is how property gets taken sometimes. Not all at once, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a trench dug before sunrise, a shaded line on a fake map, and someone powerful telling you that you do not understand your own rights. I did not win because I was louder than the HOA. I won because I stayed calm long enough to gather proof. I won because I checked the deed, the survey, the permit, the easement records, and the water filings before I let anyone pressure me into a compromise. And I won because my father was right. A fence shows people where the line is. Paper proves it when they pretend they cannot see it. If you ever find yourself facing an HOA, a developer, a contractor, or a neighbor who acts like your property is just an obstacle to their plans, do not start by shouting. Start by saving every email, every photo, every notice, every map, and every record you can find. Because sometimes the strongest revenge is not revenge at all. It is making them read the document they hoped you would never have. If this story made you think about property rights, HOA power, or how easily people can be pushed around when they do not know the records, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Share this with someone who needs the reminder. Save it, in case you ever face a property dispute of your own. And subscribe for more stories where ordinary people fight back the smart way.